into your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, and good day, good afternoon, good evening here from the UK, where I'm coming to you from. It's a great privilege for me to participate in my first Global Justice Conference since becoming a fellow at Yale University's Global Justice Programme earlier this year, just before all the chaos ensued with the coronavirus pandemic. So it's excellent, of course, to all be able to congregate virtually. Obviously, I'm hoping that the next time around we can all do this in person. I wish to thank, of course, the organising committee of ASAP and indeed Professor Thomas Pogge for the opportunity to address you today. By way of background, I'm based at the University of Cambridge at the Institute of Continuing Education, and there I lead a course on international development, and I'm also a member of the Cambridge Centre for Criminal Justice, as well as wearing another hat. I'm a lawyer, a practising barrister. I was called to the bar of England and Wales by the Inner Temple. I have a mixed crime and civil practice, and I also, in terms of my research interests, they focus on economic crime and indeed the response of both large, sophisticated jurisdictions to the threats of economic crime, but also smaller, developing jurisdictions, and indeed particularly those which operate financial or business centres, including, of course, offshore financial centres. The title of my presentation today is The Impact of COVID-19 on the Global Fight Against Economic Crime. And really, economic crime threatens the development, the stability, and the sustainability of economies and societies. And therefore, during a time of a global health pandemic, indeed, it's more important now than ever to ensure that our response to economic crime, insofar as it is an important legal issue, it's an important issue of national security, and indeed a crucial issue of international development. It's therefore crucial that our response is robust to it. In this presentation, I have three aims. The first is briefly to outline what I mean by the global anti-economic crime framework, or the fight against economic crime at the global level, and indeed what sort of crimes we're looking at and talking about. The second aim is to demonstrate, by reference to recent reports by governments and non-governmental, intergovernmental and non-governmental organisations, the ways in which COVID-19 has indeed facilitated and continues to facilitate economic crime, and indeed motivates criminals to use increasingly innovative means to perpetrate their economic crime. Third, and finally, I'll discuss briefly the ways in which the global implementation framework for standards to tackle financial crime is threatened due to COVID-19, and indeed warning that this is a serious byproduct of COVID-19, which could have ravaging effects, particularly in the context of smaller jurisdictions, less resource-gifted nations, in terms of implementing international standards. So first, what do I mean by economic crime? Well, obviously, the thing that springs to mind is crime where the motivation is one of financial gain. But of course, I'm going further than simply someone stealing a small item of property, for example, stealing a car to fund a drug habit. I'm referring to grand corruption, bribery, money laundering and terrorism financing, serious fraud and other organised criminality, as well as tax crimes and market abuse. Many of these, of course, for the lawyers in the room, are predicate crimes. Others are facilitative in the sense that they are, in many ways, conduits or stepping stones for the commission of other criminality. Good examples include human trafficking or exploitation. It may be narcotics trafficking, laundering money to facilitate that type of operation. So central to tackling economic crime, ladies and gentlemen, is the acceptance of a shared challenges, shared responses ethos. Economic crime knows no borders, and therefore an international rules-based system has developed over the past few decades, really to take account of the fact that international economic crime involves the global financial system. It's an inescapable fact that whichever system or indeed market you're looking at, you will be dealing with economic crime, no matter whether it's a sophisticated, large OECD jurisdiction or indeed a small developing island nation. You're going to be encountering economic crime in some form or another in relation to the financial system. Now, really, the rules-based system internationally has developed in many ways as an offspring from the war on drugs, which we, of course, are familiar with in the US, and recently has emerged right through to the influence of the modern transparency campaign. In essence, the Financial Action Task Force is really the internationally held standard bearer. It's become unparalleled in many sense. They have set standards for anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing. Now, despite them manifesting as soft law, non-compliance with these standards is indeed seen to be a matter of grave concern for countries which operate financial centres, and indeed business centres, and any country for that matter, seeking to engage in economic development. Non-compliance is highly damaging in terms of reputational stigma, but also financial de-risking and indeed blacklisting and grey-listing by international onlookers. FATF standards have manifested as 40 AML standards. I say AML means anti-money laundering, and indeed 9 further standards relating to counter-terrorism financing. And really, they really try and tackle the idea of instigating a risk-based approach to financial regulation. They include criminalizing money laundering. They include customer due diligence and know your client reporting requirements within financial institutions, such as the suspicious activity transaction reports, and indeed high regulation when it comes to dealing with politically exposed persons. As well as, of course, standards on the country level, which relate to the collection and the sharing of beneficial ownership information relating to legal entities. Now, as well as conceiving of these best practices, FATF's work involves regional affiliate bodies which monitor and engage in peer review follow-up processes. Now, these assess the country's level of compliance with the standards, and these exercises really are predicated on strict timetables for compliance with the recommendations that are set, and indeed the recommendations and the action points which had manifested from previous reviews. So it's very much a strict timetabling exercise. And indeed, many countries that are subject to these reviews go to great expense to ensure that interim national risk assessments are conducted in between the monitoring exercises. Now, I'll return to that point in a little while. The second point I want to raise relates to increases in economic crime and their risks seen during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, in a time of a global health pandemic, of course, people and societies are at their most vulnerable. Whether it's an overrun health service, increasing unemployment, the inability to socialize or provide care to loved ones, missing weddings, funerals, birthdays, you know, we've all been there, of course. And within all of this, you have really institutional challenges, such as mounting debt and indeed a crippling justice and courts system. And at that point, it really becomes a challenge as to how to really balance this for the economic prosperity and indeed well-being of a society. Now, of course, it's a mess, and there's no other way to phrase it, unfortunately. And that's not even to mention the countless deaths and injuries that have been suffered as a result of this iniquitous and indiscriminate disease. Sadly, in the context of our field, times like this pave the way for dangerous opportunity, and indeed an environment in which transgressors of economic crime, indeed the aforementioned crimes, they really prey on the fears and the vulnerabilities, these most basic human emotions, which are so very heightened during times of crisis. Indeed, in many ways, COVID-19 has made it easier for countries to respond, in the sense that it targets one's response in a way that is incredibly heightened. But at the same time, it's exposed the cracks in the system. And in many ways, it's made it more difficult for countries to keep on top of this. In many ways, it's made it easier for criminals. Think about it. Many of us are spending our days on end on our own, in front of our laptops or computers, in our home work environments, and we may continue to do so for months to come. And of course, many of us are craving human interaction, the types of which we all miss from being in offices and our usual places of work. And this is perhaps, isn't it, the most suitable backdrop, opportunistically, for perpetrators of economic crime to conduct the old-fashioned confidence trick. Now, there have been reports of significant fraud relating to COVID-19, which I'll provide an overview of now, relating principally to the UK, but I think it's applicable in many senses internationally. The first relates to misdirection and misappropriation of COVID financial relief, whether it's in the form of government financial relief or indeed in the context of private sector financial products such as bounce-back loans. In the UK, we announced, as indeed has been the case in other jurisdictions, we announced a furlough scheme whereby the government would subsidise 80% of salaries of workers, of wages, for a period of time, obviously to correlate with the limits imposed by working remotely. Now, there have also been, as I say, bounce-back loans, reduced rates for businesses, other incentives to get the economy moving. Now, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is our tax authority, have estimated that in the UK at present, some £3.5 billion of furlough claims, so of these wages claims, were fraudulent or paid in error. Now, it's widely accepted that these schemes were prone to abuse and continue to be prone to abuse based on the size of the financial packages and indeed the speed at which these were having to be integrated and given out to businesses to try and save livelihoods, save jobs, and of course save businesses. Now, to say corners may have been cut is probably an understatement. Enforcement authorities in the UK are reviewing at present some 27,000 cases in the UK whereby fraud or error is suspected. And the National Audit Office has initially assessed that over half of those which were fraudulent were perpetrated by organised crime gangs posing as legitimate business. A brief example of one of these such fraudulent schemes, or indeed a report of which, is worth noting, and that is what's called the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you, of course, may have similar regimes in your respective countries. And really, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was a bounce-back scheme designed to get people out and about supporting restaurants in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown. The model was simple. The government picked up half the cost of the restaurant bill for customers eating out between Mondays and Wednesdays. Now, one allegation of fraud was reported in the UK, whereby the owner of a takeaway restaurant, who would not have been eligible for this type of scheme, falsified records allegedly to suggest that he had operated a sit-down restaurant in which to benefit from the scheme, and he was said to have benefited to the tune of several £100,000. Now, as well as this, of course, the Financial Action Task Force, which I referred to earlier and which I will come back to again in a little while, issued emergency guidance to the types of misconduct being reported increasingly. There has been a global sharp increase in general and online fraud. Globally, we've seen increased instances of cyber hacking, cyber threats, phishing, identity theft, impersonation, and dishonest pressure selling. Now, Interpol, the International Enforcement Agency, reported that many cases have emerged of organised criminals impersonating healthcare workers, claiming that a relative of theirs is sick and requiring payments for treatment. So they would call up people, pretend to be healthcare professionals, stating that a friend or relative needed some emergency payments for medical treatment relating to COVID. Now, of course, we're all familiar, I dare say, aren't we, of the classic phishing scam, the email scam, whereby you'd get an email claiming that some person in a far-off land was about to give you millions of pounds as by way of an inheritance. Now, of course, while many of this to people may seem
3 minutes left.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
While much of this would seem really quite an unimaginable type of scenario, doesn't COVID present us with a landscape, given the numbers, the fact that many of us know people who've become ill? Doesn't it make us think that all of this is a lot more imaginable? Now, at a very basic level, online payments are now becoming the norm. Where banks and branches are closed, you have to ask yourself, are you still comfortable with sharing personal data over the telephone, including paying for things by way of bank details being spoken over the telephone? Socially, of course, and this relates back to some of the schemes I've mentioned, there's a growing visibility of people getting government handouts. And of course, socially, there's also an issue with the fact that everybody wants them, even if technically they don't quite qualify for them. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll risk straying into question time just so that I can deal with this point, but it's finally the ways in which the global fight against economic crime is becoming threatened due to COVID-19, beyond the fact that economic crime is seemingly intensifying and innovating during it. The international framework needs to be alive to the fact that while the good guys are good, the bad guys are getting badder quicker. And the above examples demonstrate this in spades. The virus has exposed the fragility of the global fight against economic crime. Despite the fact that we're seeing successes reported in the media week in, week out of assets being frozen, assets being seized, we are also equally seeing the figures that I've mentioned demonstrating sizable cracks and failings. The Financial Action Task Force conceded that during the initial lockdown, its ongoing review process, which I referred to in my opening, cannot take place with regards to countries while this pandemic is ongoing. And that's obvious for obvious reasons, that the on-site visits that they carry out cannot take place in person. As such, deadlines have been extended for countries to engage in the follow-up process and monitoring reviews in anticipation of the next round of evaluations. Some deadlines have been extended to as far away as 2022. While this is unsurprising,
1 minute.
Thank you. While this is unsurprising, of course, it demonstrates, doesn't it, that that momentum is seemingly an aspect which is potentially a collateral issue. Now, in my research, I found that momentum for some jurisdictions is the paramount feature. It is essentially the very ingredient they need to engage with the FATF process. Now, I specialize in Caribbean nations, which have in short time developed from barter-based economies right through until sophisticated business and financial centers. Yet many of them along the way have remained underdeveloped in terms of constitutional reform and the legal institutions that provide for an effective framework to deal with economic crime. Now, frankly, the reality, colleagues, it's concerning, isn't it, that not only has COVID-19 presented increased and innovative economic crime threats, but momentum in the global economic crime fight seems to be now somewhat sidelined, insofar, at least, as international monitoring is concerned. It provides criminals not only with a landscape of increased opportunity and innovation, but also an environment in which controls may be lacking, corners may be cut, or indeed, it may be the case where the momentum is simply slowing down due to deadlines being extended and resources placed elsewhere. And I'll leave you with this final thought. When some of the countries that I've been researching have engaged in 10 years of significant reform, a good example is the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean, where 10 years ago, a commission of inquiry found systemic corruption allegations at ministerial level, which resulted in a loss of sovereignty for that jurisdiction. Since then, fast forward 10 years, many reforms on the areas of anti-bribery, tax information exchange, the creation of beneficial ownership registers and economic substance laws are demonstrating progress, at least in the right direction. Now, of course, if that isn't momentum driven, I don't know what else is. The reality is that momentum comes together with political will and an infrastructure that's propagated internationally, and that creates the global framework whereby countries are aligning on their responses and their implementations of standards. The only problem really, insofar as this is concerned, is that momentum seems not to be quite there. Understandably, perhaps so, but concerningly nonetheless. Thank you for your kind attention, and of course I'll welcome any questions or indeed the chance to discuss this with you all later.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for this very interesting and fascinating talk. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but as I know, we're gonna take the questions, right? Like the organizers and me, and send it to you later on. Then we continue with our second talk, entitled Neither Invisible Nor Targeted, Innovation, Human Rights, and Group Vulnerability in COVID-19 Contexts. The speakers are Sergio Marcos Carvalho, Joana de Souza, Carolina Fiorini from the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil. So we are, looking forward to your talk.
Listening, Joanna. There's probably a problem on your mic.
Maybe, yeah. Can you adjust your mic somehow? Sorry, who's gonna be the speaker for the next talk? From the okay, Joanna.
If you remove the earphones, you could try that.
Is there anyone from the group who can present the talk, if not Joanna? Well,
Joanna,
I'm sorry.
can you try without the earphones? We're not listening to you.
Depending on how long that takes, we can also take one question for Dominic. Or what do you think, support team? Yes?
I'm the third one to present. If you would like,
oh, okay, perfect.
I could go, and then they tackle the problem they're dealing with now, and then they take my place. What do you think?
Okay, we can do that. Sorry, which one is your talk?
I'm Nathalia.
Or Nathalia, yeah. Sorry, you're the
Single line of ICU beds.
Oh, you're the next one. Okay. Let's do that. Then we go with Nathalia's talk, and we try Joanna after you.
Okay. Like her to stop sharing the screen. or else it's going to be a little confusing.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, then I should introduce you at least. So, welcome, Nathalia. It's a pleasure to have you here as well. Nathalia comes from the University of São Paulo, and your talk is going to be a single line of ICU beds in times of pandemic, the only way to break the necropolitics of sorry, I can't even read my notes. Sorry. Yeah, please just go ahead. Sorry.
No problem at all. Okay, so first of all, good afternoon, everybody. And Felicitas Holzer, our moderator, through which I'm going to thank the organization of this fabulous event. Good afternoon to all the colleagues in this panel. It is a true pleasure to expose this research of mine and to listen to your brilliant ideas as well. So as Felicitas just introduced, my research and hopefully future paper is called Single Line of ICU Beds in Times of Pandemic, the only way to break the necropolitics of economic access to health. What I studied during this past months, in which more than 160,000 people died in Brazil, 1,278,000 died around the world, is that how could we assure, especially through law, that everyone would have the same opportunity to, at the end of the day, survive, basically? I mean, how could we erase, even for a moment, the economic and social gap so everybody, regardless of their wealth, their income, social class, ethnicity, etc., has a chance to recover from such a deadly virus? So in a pandemic such as COVID-19, which requires hospital ICU beds in large quantities to save people who contracted the disease from dying from the pulmonary complications caused by the virus, the access to these beds cannot reinforce the economic and social inequalities so common to Brazilian society and other societies, of course, but my theme here is to talk about Brazil. And relegating to death citizens without financial means to pay for their necessary medical care. So to avoid and repair injury to fundamental constitutional precepts regarding, number one, social right to health, which in Brazil is mentioned in many constitutional articles, such as Articles 6, 23, 24, 194, 196 to 200. Number two, regarding fundamental right to life, Articles 5, 227, and 230. Number three, regarding the fundamental right to equality, also in Articles 5 and 196. Regarding the foundation of the Federative Republic of Brazil, called human dignity, in Article 1. And finally, regarding the fundamental objective of the Federative Republic of Brazil to build a just and solidary society, in Article 3. We must devise a way to match substantially equal access to ICU beds so as not to make the mistake of relegating the most vulnerable and poorest part of the population to death. So we're faced with this situation of massive and persistent violation of these rights and of absolute structural ineffectiveness of public health policies in a scenario that requires urgent action by the public authorities. Given the magnitude of this pandemic and the disastrous and exponential consequences for the society, it's necessary to debate and implement a means of preventing the perpetuation and the crystallization of this historic bankruptcy of the Brazilian public health system, aggravated, of course, by the pandemic resulting from the coronavirus. The Brazilian single health system, or universal health system, as of course all Brazilians here know, but some of you might not, the SUS, is based on the assumption that health is a fundamental human right, and the state must provide the conditions necessary for its full exercise through the formulation and execution of economic and social policies, aimed at reducing the risks of diseases and in establishing conditions that ensure universal and equal access to actions and services for their promotion, protection, and recovery. So I'm going to tell you something. A political party called PSOL here in Brazil, which stands for, in English, Socialism and Liberty Party, filed an action that we call ADPF, which in our poor translation means Action for Non-Compliance with a Fundamental Precept, basically this, at our Supreme Court, our Federal Supreme Court, to question the treatment of hospital bed division even before the peak of contamination happened in Brazil. That's because there were already news that ICU beds that were vacant in private hospitals, reserved for those, you know, who pay for health insurance, were already being used, being assigned to elective surgeries, such as, you know, abdominoplasty, other cosmetic surgeries, etc. While the queues in the public system were giant, beds were all occupied, ventilators were all occupied, and people were dying from lack of treatment, from lack of these beds. As you might have guessed, the action was not a success in our Supreme Court, and here we are with more than 160,000 people dead, 52 million cases. I seriously think that in the near future, that information will finally sink in, and we'll see the economic and social characteristics of the majority of these deaths and cases, especially cases with serious sequels. And it will be disappointing, but not surprising at all. So I based myself on the concept of the Cambridge author Akin Mbembe, and the concept is necropolitics, to explain this reality accepted by today's society, which is those who have money are more likely to survive, and those who don't, good luck, basically this, as a form of the politics of death, so a form of death politics, and that's actually the meaning of necro, right, death. This tacit choice of who dies and who lives, and we know that the rope always breaks to the weakest side. So according to Mbembe, the maximum expression of sovereignty lies to a large extent in the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Therefore, to take life or to let someone live are the limits of sovereignty, its key attributes. So exercising sovereignty is to exercise control over mortality and to define life as an empowerment and its expression. So in the context of a pandemic, there is this, we can call a chronification of the state's necropolitical performance, producing deaths, but not just any death. We already know that the poor population has confirmed itself in a series of studies as a great victim of this pandemic in Brazil. We are actually triggering historical processes here. We're not just living a new disease and seeing what happens. We are cutting history open. We are cutting our political and social reality open. We are watching the effects of the pandemic on the lives of some infamous subjects of our society. Lives that cannot be even mourned, as we know. So the poor, the Black, the indigenous people, the homeless people, interns of the prison system, among others. Will they die without a trace, without a record, except from the numerical data of victims? Don't their lives matter as well? Are they worthless? So basically what I'm trying to state is that one life is not worth and cannot be worth more than the other, let alone based on economic criteria. Therefore, this article that I'm writing aims to investigate the hypothesis, and I quote, a single line of ICU beds in times of pandemic. Is it the only way to break the necropolitics of economic access to health? Then I have two specific objectives, which is analyze the constitutional and the legal regime of our SUS, and two, fundamental rights and constitutional guarantees linked to public health in Brazil, in order to fulfill, of course, this general objective of denouncing one of the aspects of the unequal impacts of pandemic in Brazil. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm here available for questions, for opinions, criticism, comments, whatever you want. So thank you once again for your attention. I'm here.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathalia, for this very nice presentation. So I think we have at least 7 minutes for questions, or more, actually more than 7 minutes. So please feel free to ask them in the chat, and Guillermo, you're gonna read them, right? Okay. Or shall I read them? Okay, I will just do it. So we have one, and we have no questions so far. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Oh, sorry. You. Okay. Sorry. I just seeing in the chat that. Sorry, Nathalia.
In the chat was actually mine for Dominic.
Exactly. You would like to ask a question. Okay. We can do that. Let's go for.
Oh, I just saw a question from Raphael. I guess he sent a question right now. Yeah.
Yes. So the question here is, Nathalia thinks that Bolsonaro has cooperated towards of the coronavirus.
Well, I guess I understood what he said, and I absolutely agree. My answer is yes. Having a governor, and I mean a president like him, made everything worse. He tackled the pandemic very badly. He actually doubted science at all, in a whole. He doubted the danger of the pandemic, and he keeps doing that every day. So yeah, I do have this criticism, this political criticism, as long as in my article I'm talking about, just juridical criticism, this legal criticism, but of course it has everything to do with how it is politically dealt with in Brazil. So yes, for your question, my answer is yes, Bolsonaro has cooperated with the coronavirus and not with us. He didn't fight the pandemic, he actually helped it against us. It was yesterday or just 2 days ago, I don't remember, but he said in a press conference that he called us maricas, everybody, and that actually means a very homophobic thing to say. But it means that we are, I'm gonna say this because this is very strong, but you have to know the meaning if you don't speak Portuguese. It basically, you're faggots, which is ridiculous, but it's not even something like, it's not a curse because everyone can be gay, first of all. Secondly, he said that because we are afraid of the pandemic, of the virus. So he basically said that because we are afraid of having it, of being contracted with this virus and actually dying. So yeah, the way he's tackling this pandemic is just the worst. I don't know, even compared to Trump, if it's even worse than Trump. But then they're competing for this very ridiculous thing, this position of being the worst of tackling a pandemic. Yeah, that's what I have to say for Raphael.
Okay, thank you, Raphael, and Nathalia, thanks for answering the question. Is there any other question for Nathalia's talk? No other question? Okay,
so,
I do.
Mrs. Holzer, I have a suggestion. We can make the question for the first participant, the question
exactly,
that we left behind. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That was my idea right now, to say we can actually ask questions for
I'm
Dominic.
sorry, let me just see if you can listen to me at this time.
Okay,
I'm
excellent.
my cell phone. Okay,
Perfect.
thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, then we have actually a question, right, by Nathalia.
Yeah, that was me.
So, yeah.
You can read it, of course.
Sorry, do you want to ask a question, or yeah, please go ahead and ask.
I sent here, but I can read it out loud,
okay.
Of course. He actually PM'd me saying that he would answer later, but now that we have time, if he's here, it's okay. Okay. So I just, of course, congratulated for the expanded work, and my question was, don't you think that the lawyer's obligation to hand over like his client, if there is a suspicion that the money he's paying is a result of crimes, especially economic crimes, don't you think that this violates the right to ample defense? I mean, how to tackle this weighing? Don't they need legal advising as well? I know it's a very hard question. I'm so sorry for this, but I just wanted to listen.
It's frankly, thank you, Nathalia, for your question, and indeed, equally, congratulations on an excellent presentation to you as well. It's a very fascinating question, because it's one, as a lawyer, I'm asked very regularly. First and foremost is, how do you defend someone if you know they're guilty? And it's a lot more complex than that, because we're obviously, as lawyers, bound by strict ethical guidelines. And indeed, our first duty is to the court, to make sure that we are not misleading the court as to what case we put before it. If, for example, a client has told you he has committed the offence, and that he is therefore guilty of the offence, he or I could not put anything before the court which would imply, suggest, or assert that he is indeed innocent. For example, the most obvious is if he wanted to plead not guilty, but he had confessed to me as his lawyer that he actually did do it. To do so would put the lawyer in a very bad, compromising position, because they would be misleading the court, and effectively would be obviously guilty of a professional offence, but also complicit in perjury as well. So, from that's the first point. Second, which I think is a slightly more nuanced one, is if, for example, you have a suspicion that the client is guilty of the offence, and at that stage you have to really consider the extent to which, what he's actually told you, or she has actually told you. You can't simply, conduct yourself in a way that breaches your professional duties to your client if the words haven't come out of their mouth. Now, of course, if, for example, there happens to be a confession that the client is about to commit an offence, then, of course, you're under an ethical duty to raise that to law enforcement for the purposes of preventing crime. But, of course, if you're mid-case, for example, and the client actually tells you something, that he did commit an offence, but he still wants to maintain a plea of not guilty, then you would have to effectively not mislead the court. And that may result in the lawyer having to excuse themselves from the case, because to do otherwise would mean professional embarrassment, and of course would mislead the court, which you can't do. So I hope that answers the question in a roundabout way.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question? We have time for one or two more questions to either Nathalia or Dominic. Okay, so it seems there's no more question for the moment. So then I would like to welcome Joana again. And we are happy to listen to your, looking forward to listen to your talk.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. For those who join us in this exceptional event, Build Back Better conference, good afternoon if you are in Brazil, or perhaps still good morning if you are, depending on your location. Thank you, Professor Holzer, for the careful introduction. And we have these problems of the sound, but I think right now we are okay. And congratulations to Professor Dominic for the great presentation on your fascinating research. I'm Joana Machado, Professor of Constitutional Law at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil. We will present a paper co-authored by me, Professor Sergio Negri, who is here too, Professor of Private Law, and Carolina Giovannini, an undergraduate student at the same institution. This work results from a partnership between LAVIT, a lab of research and legal advisory on institutional violence and human rights, coordinated by me, and NEAPID, a Center for Advanced Studies in Person, Innovation, and Law, coordinated by Professor Sergio Negri. And Carolina Giovannini participates as a researcher at NEAPID. This work is also a product of the research line Human Rights and Innovation of the graduate program in law at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora, in which Professor Sergio and I perform as faculty members of the program. So neither invisible nor targeted. innovation, human rights, and group vulnerability in the COVID-19 context. Our work exploratory analyzes the technologies and innovations used to face the COVID pandemic, problematizing the differential allocation of these measures' impacts, considering technical, legal, and ethical challenges. We adopt a reconstructive approach method. Our theoretical framework is the distinction proposed by Judith Butler between precariousness and precarity. The mortality rate due to the COVID pandemic demonstrates the inevitable precariousness of life. If life is not guaranteed for anyone, if we all depend on other people for the emergency and maintenance of our lives, in the face of a virus that per se does not discriminate, do we share the same vulnerability? If all human lives were considered valid, if they all generate equal social value, if the possibility of losing any and all life proved to be subject to mourning and social regret, we would share the same vulnerability in this condition. But as Butler argues, although precariousness is an universal future of life, not all lives inspire the condition of mourning, as they do not conform to social modeling, to the normativity that frames lives as valid lives, considering social markers of gender, sexuality, race, citizenship, and nationality. There are dissident bodies, there are subalternity bodies, and there is differential allocation of the precarity of life between these bodies, between people and group of people. Hence, there are different layers of vulnerability, politically induced or amplified. In the search for the best strategies to fight the pandemic, to guarantee life, the valid one, there is a trail of violations, especially disproportionate to other lives. Detailing the technologies used to fight the pandemic, combined with the analysis of concrete cases, we seek to demonstrate the lack of proportionality of measures that have been naturalized in the face of the crisis, especially regarding the rights of politically vulnerable groups, either invisible or overexposed and targeted. The work is structured around three main axes, deeply interwoven: a normative one, the technological one, and the ethical or political one. At the normative level, we highlight data protection's detachment as a fundamental right of privacy, traditional meaning, and its consequent connection with other democratic freedoms. At the technological level, the work details some of the primary measures for using personal data in the fight against the pandemic to allow a more accurate assessment of the risks imposed on the exercise of the other rights. There are in course several experiences based on the use of technologies for the extensive data collection, monitoring of people in quarantine using geolocation data, strict tracking of infected people route, contact tracing, using smartphone data, massive sending of SMS messages with the complete identification of the places visited by infected people. At the ethical and political level, we seek to demonstrate an unequal and especially disproportionate allocation of the surveillance impacts to groups that historically experience vulnerabilities politically induced or expanded. In Brazil, initially, two initiatives were implemented: intelligent monitoring system in São Paulo and social isolation index, developed by the Brazilian company Unequal. Both initiatives inform that the processed data are anonymized, being used in maps that can indicate the population's movement and the possible agglomerations. Different anonymization practice and techniques exist with variable degrees of robustness. Anonymized data do fall out the scope of data protection legislation, but the Article 29 Data Protection Working Party considers three risks that are essential for anonymization. One, singling out, which corresponded to the possibility to isolate some or all records which identify an individual in the data set. Two, linkability, which is the ability to link at least two records concerning the same data subject or a group of data subjects, either in the same database or in two different databases. If an attacker can establish, for instance, by means of correlation analysis, that two records are assigned to a same group of individuals but cannot single out individuals in this group, the technique provides resistance against singling out but not against linkability. Three, inference, which is the possibility to deduce with significant probability the value of an attribute from the values of a set of other attributes. Techniques of the identification and anonymization are the subject of ongoing research, and such research has shown consistently that no technique is devoid of shortcomings per se. Advances in identification expose this promise as too often illusory. The utility of privacy of data are intrinsically connected. No regulation can increase data privacy without also decreasing data utility. As the utility of data increases, the privacy decreases. Another tool in pandemic response is digital contact tracing. People who have been in close contact with an individual infected with the virus run a significant risk of also being infected and of infecting others in turn. Contact tracing is a disease control methodology that lists all people who have been in close proximity to a carrier of the virus. However, such apps cannot replace but only support manual contact tracing performed by qualified public health staff. In the context of a contact tracing application, we should give careful consideration to the principle of data minimization and data protection by design and by defect. In Chile, a newspaper released the Ministry of Health's georeference database in the form of maps, which allows a specific view of confirmed cases of COVID in streets and neighborhoods. According to these newspapers, each point that indicates a person tested positive for the disease was moved between 50 and 100 meters. Despite the addition of noise, it is possible to view specific blocks, buildings, and houses in which there are confirmed cases, making it possible to identify owners based on the association of their addresses with the points elaborated on the maps. As cartography makes it possible to visualize the social isolation or the number of confirmed cases in certain places, it is possible to make inferences that associate the spread of the disease, the place, and the group that frequents this place. This type of publication represents enormous discriminatory potential. Once more in Chile.
Sorry, Joanna, you're on mute. Joanna, you're on mute, sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
you hear me? For the virus. Vocês estão me escutando? Okay. In South Korea, there was a second wave of infections with a large concentration of new cases in a single neighborhood. From the digital contact tracing system, a 29-year-old man was identified as a virus spreader. Contact tracing is a disease control methodology that lists all people who have been in close proximity to a carrier of the virus. The newspapers started to divulge that this man would have visited on the same night 5 different establishments frequented by PP. I'm sorry? Hello?
Sorry.
Okay.
Can I? Yes. Can everyone else mute their mics, please?
Okay.
Yes.
So the newspapers started to divulge that this man would have visited on the same night 5 different establishments frequented by LGBT people. The coronavirus outbreak was then linked in social networks and local publications to gay clubs, and there was a strong reaction against the LGBT population, blaming it for the spread of the virus. The dialogue between science and politics point the need to adopt several restrictive measures of rights and guarantees, individual and collective, in the construction of public policies to contain the virus. For many states, it means having to renegotiate with society this set of rights, albeit in an exceptional and provisional dimension. It is a huge test in which states are challenged to adopt measures qualified for this sanitary battle, and in scenarios more democratic, even if only formally, to justify the adequacy and necessity of these restrictive measures of rights. Even busy
15 minutes.
Survive. Okay. Even busy to survive the crisis, the society, on the other hand, is challenged to evaluate this justification with attention to possible abuses and risks of authoritarian legacies. In conclusion, the work points out the need to build alternatives more sensitive to the different layers of vulnerability to which people individually and collectively are subject to. So in general, these are the findings of our work. Hopefully we will have a conversation about the paper as well. Questions and comments are welcome. Thank you very much for your attention and especially for your patience.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanna, also for your fascinating talk. Now we have 4 minutes to ask questions, and I got one here. So by Rafael Santos, the question is, what does Joanna think the poor person in the suburbs does or needs to do to survive in view of the chaos caused by the pandemic? Can the public administration cooperate in any way? Joanna, I think you're on mute again.
Okay, the final part of the question, please. My internet.
Yeah, no worries. The final part of the question is or the second question is, can the public administration cooperate in any way? And the first part, just to repeat that, is what a poor person would do to survive in the chaos of the pandemic. And I reckon the second part is what the public, or what the government and public administration has as means to improve the situation for poor people in suburbs. You're on mute. You are still on mute. No.
I'm sorry, yes, now, okay. Let me see the question again.
Sorry, Raphael, if you hear, can you maybe clarify the question? If there's any...
Can
Sorry.
I talk in part to
Yes.
join? Can I?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Joana, consegue me escutar?
Joanna?
I'm sorry, I'm have such much trouble with this, especially to, well, yes. Thank you, Rafael, for your question. Yes, I'm trying to address this challenge you mentioned here. So, can the public administration cooperate in any way? Yes, it can, but again, we are talking about institutional violations. So we have this search for techniques to combat and to deal with the virus. But so in this search, we are reproducing some various types of institutional violations. So it's difficult to if you don't know this the technical dimension of this technology. So first we have to produce a culture of information about the data protection. So first of all, we have to spread information, technical information about these technologies, and demand more transparency from the government, and adequate justification of the measures that restrict our rights. And so yes, we can have this kind of help, but in Brazil we are dealing with a space without the culture of transparency, and also we don't have implemented yet a technical agents that will regulate this kind of subject as data protection. So we are dealing with a very insecure scenario, and so we have to demand the implementation of these agents, but as well demand more transparency from the government, and follow this kind of measures that promise so much advances, but also have different kind of impacts from people, and are vulnerable groups of people.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna take one more question for Joanna before we proceed to our last talk. This one is, it's a question by Caroline Plaka. She says, Joanna, you have just mentioned authoritarianism in your lecture. What is the relationship between authoritarian governments and vulnerability?
Thank you so much for your question. Yes, we can say that an authoritarian government tends to adopt more restrictive measures, and because this kind of government doesn't care so much about rights and guarantees. So this kind of government tends to be more abusive, and when we deal with a scenario more less democratic, we know that some groups that historically are more neglected, they will suffer more, because we are not, this is the kind of assessment that we have reading some critical legal studies as Butler and other authors that don't treat everyone as equal just because we have this liberal perspective of law. So the more the government shows an authoritarian perspective, we have some groups that will suffer more the restriction and the violations of its rights. So yes, I agree with you. I think we can establish a relationship between a more vulnerability, because the vulnerability, as Butler argues, is associated with the social protection or network protection of states and society. So who cares about your life? So who cares if your life will be guaranteed or not? If your life is considered a valid one, so you can count on a social a network of protection. But authoritarian government tends to punish more people who don't fit in this kind of normativity as valid life. So I think we can establish this relationship between authoritarian government and more vulnerability, especially with layers of vulnerability, because we are not subject to the same kind of violations.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, and then it's my pleasure to present the last speaker group. It's the speaker group is Yannick Markov, Luca Lazzarini, João Pedro Bregolin, from the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth in Brazil. They're going to present a paper entitled Making the Invisible Visible, Systemic Exclusion from Social Protection in Latin America and Path Towards a Rights-Based Approach. So please go ahead. I don't know who's going to present this.
We're going to share presenting duties equally, but João Pedro is sharing the screen. Thank you so much, Felicitas, for the kind introduction. Thank you so much for having us, and congratulations to all the earlier speakers for the excellent presentations. My name is Yannick Markov, and together with my two colleagues from the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, João Pedro Dietz and Luca Lazzarini, we're going to be presenting on systemic exclusion from social protection, both before the crisis and during the crisis. Next slide, please. Our presentation is motivated by the observation that the COVID crisis has really put a spotlight on social protection. And at the same time, the crisis has really exposed the deficiencies that exist in the system, the gaps in coverage that we have. And across the globe, we've seen expansions of social protection systems to varying degrees. At the same time, that then also opened up an unprecedented window of opportunity, we think, for reforms of the social protection sector in line with a rights-based approach. Since these gaps exist, it's no wonder that two of the most vulnerable groups identified in the literature during the COVID crisis, informal workers and migrants, are also two groups that face systemic exclusion from adequate social protection. Next slide, please. Our paper is thus motivated by making these invisible groups, invisible to social protection, to state-owned social protection, visible. We focus on Latin America for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a or Latin America is the birthplace for some of the most prominent social protection programs there are in the global South, such as Bolsa Familia in Brazil. Secondly, informality is pervasive in Latin America. And thirdly, it's the place where we currently see the second largest migration crisis in the world unfolding, and that is the exodus from Venezuela to other countries. In specific, we're focusing on case studies from two countries, Peru and Colombia. The questions we're asking, or to make these invisible people visible, our study proceeds in 3 steps. First of all, we're asking, okay, how prevalent a problem is that? Can we quantify who these people, who these invisible people are, and their exclusion from social protection, both before the crisis and now during COVID-19? Second of all, we're looking at what legal provisions and administrative boundaries might prevent them, informal workers and migrants, from accessing social protection. And thirdly, we're asking, okay, what can be done moving to a better normal for social protection after the crisis to expand and reform the social protection sector in line with a rights-based approach. Next slide, please. Jumping right in, we analyzed microdata from the National Household Survey in Peru. And we found that almost 70% of households in Peru are households that draw the majority of their household income from workers earning informal incomes. So these people are extremely vulnerable to income loss and to the economic ramifications of the crisis. 42% of these people have not had access to any social protection in the last 3 years, and only a fifth of them are currently receiving one of the flagship cash transfers of the country. That leaves a considerable portion of the invisible that you can see by decile in the chart on the bottom left of your screen, so the lightly gray shaded area. These are the people that neither currently receive a transfer, nor have they received any transfer in the recent past, so likely are not covered with up-to-date information in the social registry. And plus, they have informal jobs not giving them access to social insurance, leaving them essentially invisible to social protection. We quantify this population group to be as many as 1.81 million invisible informal households before COVID-19, the majority of which clusters in the lower income deciles. Next slide, please. If we're looking at migrants, and here we're looking specifically at Venezuelan migrants for which we managed to acquire microdata, we see that the picture is even more bleak. 87% of migrant households in Peru draw the majority of their income from informal sources, and only 3.5% have access to any social protection, let alone state-owned social protection, which further lowers this figure to below 2%. Taken together, almost 86% of migrant households in Peru have neither received social assistance since they moved to Peru, nor are they covered by adequate social insurance. Next slide, please. Now, if we're looking at what happened during COVID-19, is really interesting. So what we're doing in the microdata is we try to estimate who was covered by the expansion of the social protection system, the emergency social protection expansion that was introduced by the Peruvian government. And here we see quite good coverage rates of the informal. Almost 2/3 of households covered during social protection. You see that in the light blue shade in the graph, with over 90% of informal households covered. Up to the fifth decile, you even have all households theoretically being eligible for social protection or for cash transfers during the crisis. However, this comes with a very important caveat, and that is that access to both regular social protection and emergency social protection is conditional on having legal and administrative access to social protection in the first place. What I exactly mean by that is going to be covered by my two colleagues, and Luca is going to make a start and is going to make a case that it's not just social protection or like not just the economic inclusion criteria, but also legal and administrative access that matters. Over to you, Luca.
Thanks, Yannick. As shown in the table, migrants do not have access to flagship social protection measures, except for those dedicated to minors, nor to employment programs. This is largely due to administrative barriers. Most programs indeed operate on the basis of the socioeconomic classification of the beneficiary in the SISFO system, which requires for migrants an immigration card. Most migrants do not have such document because it applies exclusively to foreigners with an employment contract or those married to a citizen. In 2018, an attempt was made to widen the documents to access the SISFO system through a ministerial resolution. However, due to the formulation of the norm, such flexibility could not be implemented. As for informal workers, we can see that the only measure explicitly targeting independent workers is Impulsa Peru. However, working age social protection programs, as well as employment programs, apply also to certain categories of informal workers or to the households in which they live in, provided that the requirements and conditions of the schemes are met, including the classification as extremely poor or poor required by most measures. On the contrary, non-poor informal workers, who might nevertheless have certain vulnerabilities, fall outside of the scope of the programs. Next slide, please. An important premise is that more than 12 million individuals, or around 72% of the economically active population, worked in the informal economy in 2018. Moreover, most migrants in Peru work informally in urban areas. The most immediate consequence and impact of confinement measures on informal workers is the impossibility to work, which is often their only source of income. So, given the scale of the informal economy in the country, an inclusive response was key to avoid a significant increase in poverty levels. The response of the government encompassed two measures which apply to poor and extremely poor households, including those with informal workers. These in particular are the Io Me Quedo in Casa and the Bono Rural. In addition to this, the Bono Independiente was explicitly dedicated to non-poor, although vulnerable, independent workers, which again were not covered by pre-COVID social protection. It should be stressed that the Ministry of Labor and Employment Promotion was granted by the decree declaring the state of emergency exceptional access to personal data, including the tax and banking system, as well as an electronic spreadsheet for private companies and the list of public sector personnel. As a result, the ministry was able to rapidly identify almost 800,000 vulnerable individuals and provide assistance to them. Referring instead to migrants, these were not included in the economic support provided by the government, since the measures once again relied on the SISFO. The Ministry of Development implemented a cash transfer targeting around 63,000 extremely vulnerable Venezuelans. However, this covered less than half of the estimated poor Venezuelans in the country. Next slide, please. So, to conclude, countries with high levels of informality, such as Peru, face a disproportionate challenge in the response to COVID, as a result of the vulnerability of informal workers to covariant shocks. This in turn highlights the fragility of informal employment and the importance of the government action facilitating the transition to the formal economy. Through the Buon Independiente, there was an extension of social protection to non-poor but vulnerable informal workers previously not covered. This case also demonstrates the capacity of the government to identify and reach in a short time informal workers. However, the human rights-based approach to social protection demands adequate benefits. The benefits granted were not sufficient to satisfy the needs of those who cannot work, do not have other source of income, and their dependents. Further, the benefits predominantly focus on urban areas, whereas 96% of individuals in rural areas in Peru are informal and often have a minor income. Referring instead to migrants, as we saw, these were largely excluded from social protection pre and post-COVID as a result of the administrative barrier we discussed, which hindered the fulfillment of several fundamental rights. So to conclude, the human rights-based approach to social protection also grants benefit accessibility. As a consequence, administrative obstacles which prevent the enjoyment of the benefits should be removed with a view to effectively implement and fulfill the human right to social protection. Thank you, everyone. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
No, that's not. I was about to say that's not the final. Okay.
Yeah. So sorry, I didn't see my mic was cut. So thank you, Luca, for passing it to me. I'll give a short overview of Colombia's situation for informal workers and migrants, both before and after COVID. A bit less numbers than Yannick because that's his specialty. But to start off with, as many countries in Latin America, there's a high rate of informal workers, with 60.6% of the working population being informals. But there still exists in Colombia a coverage from the state in order to diminish the existing risks for this population. So similarly to Peru, there's a universal health coverage, which, even though it's not really in our goes beyond our aim, but it's a good point, but it's not enough to help with income. So 95% of population, almost 95% of the population has this universal health coverage for basic needs. But more importantly, informal workers in Colombia are able to be inscribed in this SISBEN, which is the system to identify potential beneficiaries, which is an inscription on demand, so workers can easily enter in the system. And the most important part of this is that SISBEN was used for COVID-19 to select and identify the beneficiaries of the emergency cash transfer that they put in place, which is the Ingreso Solidario. There were other programs that went through a vertical expansion, which means the values of the programs were raised, but this one was for those that did not have any assistance or almost no assistance before. So because of that, the selection of those that are poor, vulnerable workers and informal workers managed to benefit from state's protection. And this is going to be distinct from the migrant rights that were given to the Venezuelans in Colombia.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. To 20, yeah.
As you can see, Colombia is the country that received the most Venezuelan migrants. And what's interesting to know is that the legal framework for migrants started being developed with the exodus of Venezuelans in 2015, and with an important step in 2017, which is this PEP, which is a legal stay visa for 2 years, which is very simplified, but still has some rules. And because of that, you end up needing to have a passport, and entry to the country must be done through a migratory control post, which ends up meaning that because the passport in Venezuela is very expensive, it's one of the top 5 most expensive in the world. For renewing, it's 2 years of the minimum wage for many. What you end up having is a high amount of Venezuelan migrants that are undocumented because of these requirements. And the regulation in the country is focused specifically on determining which is going to be the status of the migrants and not on which rights they should acquire. So, because most migrants are undocumented, what the result is that they are not in the SISBEM, and they are excluded from the most important social protection programs outside of humanitarian assistance. And then when COVID-19 hits, the response of the state, which was very broad and used SISBEM, ends up not reaching undocumented migrants with any cash transfer at all. So even though the Ingreso Solidario reached over 40,000 migrant families, it didn't reach any of those undocumented migrants, which often are the most vulnerable, and didn't reach also those indigenous people that came from the border. So without those additional measures and this framework, I would like just to do a quick presentation on what the legal obligations that can nudge Colombia towards a path of more broad social protection. And because Colombia's constitution already recognizes non-discrimination and equal rights for foreigners, and the distinction—
18 minutes.
Okay, no, don't worry, it's fine. What you end up having is that the Constitutional Court already recognized that migrants should have basic attention from the state, most of all during a time of humanitarian crisis. And similarly, on the international framework, if we use the aspects of non-discrimination, this distinction between those different migrants needs to be justified. And even if there's a distinction, there's a minimum level that should be given to migrants, and this was not always the case. So to sum up and to present our conclusions for now, there's a systematic exclusion from social protection during regular time, but which gets even stronger during crises, even though both countries took important steps to take into account informal workers with major programs. There's also reasons for this exclusion are often related to administrative issues and reasons, as we could see. And the design of the programs should take into account those administrative questions. More importantly, COVID-19 might be a window of opportunity for the expansion of social protection, and in order to promote a rights-based approach for these marginalized population groups. And we invite you to watch Sunday. Our colleagues from IPC will also talk a lot more about this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to the group, João, Luca, and Yannick. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any question, and we're at the end of the session. So I want to thank all of you, the participants, and especially the speakers, for your very fascinating talks. I myself, as a philosopher and ethicist, learned a lot, I have to admit. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that it's highly appreciated by the organizers if you, the audience, just comment and send feedback to the email asap220comments@gmail.com. It's actually also in the chat. If not, you can directly contact the speakers. I think some of you just posted your emails like in the chat. Yes, so thank you everyone. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next sessions in the conference, and have a good evening or yeah, afternoon in Brazil. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Felicitas.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.